Hello, my name's Jeff Berino. I'm Senior Fire Investigator with AEI Corporation. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to have some fun as we spend some time looking at cutting-edge wildfire investigation techniques. This is a dynamic and fun presentation, so fasten your seatbelts. We got a few things you need to learn today. One is, how do we narrow a large 30,000 acre, 2,000 acre fire down to an exact point of origin? I'm going to show you exactly how. Fires create evidence. Many of us think they destroy evidence, but wildfires can create evidence and point us to where the fire started. We'll go through some fun stuff on that. We're going to look at some actions on case presentation, whether it's in subrogation, prosecution, or defense. We'll show you how to put together an effective case. And of course, we've got to reference some key areas in NFPA 921 and 1033 because they have some specific concepts for wildfire investigations. Let's put the pieces of the puzzle together. It's often a little daunting because wildfire investigations are different than structure fire investigations or car fire investigations. We do things slightly different, but hopefully reach the same conclusions. Here's some fun as we get started. I want everybody to smile when you look at this. This is the original Smokey the Bear. Took in 1910 after some of the big burn fires in western Colorado, and Smokey's legacy lives on today. Let's look at some of the effects of wildfire. One, the obvious direct loss: structures, outbuildings, cars, farm equipment. That's significant loss right there. Suppression losses, cost alone can run over $1 million a day in a large wildfire with aircraft and incident management teams. One example was the Camp Fire, which occurred in Northern California. And that fire alone was a $4.4 billion loss, where the entire town of Paradise was literally wiped out. Some areas have tourism. I live up in ski country. Imagine a ski area getting taken out by a wildfire. Significant economic loss. Timber is huge in parts of the western United States, and agriculture. Wildfire can disrupt that significantly, as well as some mining and surface water losses. In fact, the Denver Post did a study and showed right in Colorado, over 2.9 million people in Colorado live in the WUI area. What's WUI? Wildland Urban Interface. That's where homes back up against the forest. Like any investigation, there are obstructions. This is a real picture. I was in eastern Colorado in the middle of nowhere, slightly lost, ran into this beast in my little Toyota Tacoma and had my first obstruction. What are some obstructions we face? One, time, right? Some of these take time. They're in remote locations. We're rushed, but we have to look at the time factor. And as time from the start of the wildfire elapses till when an investigator gets there, we do have some evidence that disappears. So there are obstructions we have to overcome: time and the duration since the start of the investigation till investigators get there. Just few of many obstructions. I like this picture. This is a classic picture of a WUI zone, which I took when we were flying over parts of the Waldo Canyon burn area. Why were several homes saved? They had some good defensible space. Why were some burned with good D-space? The fire was angry that day and created a huge loss for all of us. Now, here's time to pay attention. These are all test questions. I'm only kidding. Wildfires spread in 3 big ways. Number 1 is wind, primarily driven by wind. The second, we look at the topography. Fires like to burn uphill when they can. And the final influence is the fuel package involved. Is it grass? Is it conifer trees? Is it oak brush? So we look at all 3 of these in totality, and that will help us determine how wildfires spread and explain why they spread. Here's a classic example on the picture on your right. That was taken in northern Wisconsin, actually, and the fire jumped the road. So a road's generally a good fire break, but not in this case because the wind threw embers right over the road. How does weather affect wildfires? Well, depending on what part of the country you live in, I'm sure you're familiar with some of these terms. The Chinook winds, which we see in the Front Range in Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, that's where the wind squeezes over the top of the mountains and comes roaring down the foothills and creates its own fire patterns. Those out west in the California area certainly are familiar with the Santa Ana winds, which blow east to west and will literally blow fire right down to the ocean. Those that are involved in canyons and mountains, we look at up and down slope winds in the canyons. The wind will run upslope as the canyons, the valleys heat up, and downslope at the end of the day when the valleys cool down. Thunderstorms, T-storms, create their own weather and will steer a wildfire sometimes in a 180-degree way because thunderstorms don't know what they're supposed to do and they kind of bounce around. Plume-dominated fires, I have a picture of one later on. They are literally their own firestorm. I think we've seen some of them on TV where they will just move around and entrain air in the bottom and throw embers out up to several miles. Temperature inversions can speed up and or slow down a wildfire. A good inversion will put a cloud layer overhead and actually slow it down for a bit, but when the inversion lifts, then we got significant wildfire spread. And the one thing we look at is flying embers. They create what's called spot fires, which to an investigator may mimic a separate area of origin. So we have to rule out embers as separate origin areas. Kind of fascinating. I'm a nerd on this stuff, so you guys bear with me, okay? Wind-driven fire. I love this picture. This is taken out in Elko, Nevada, where we just a little bit of nothing, but you can see how the wind's pushing this grass fire significantly from the left part of the screen to the right part of the screen. Wind can also create some erratic fire behavior. These are called fire whirls. This was taken again out in the California area and some aggressive fire behavior, and this is a big watch out for firefighters. Let's look at how the topography affects the fire. Wind, we said, okay, it does that. Topography. Canyons will affect where a wildfire will spread. It can jump across a canyon. It can run up to a saddle. Unfortunately, that's what killed many of the firefighters in the Storm King fire in Glenwood Springs in the mid-90s. Box canyons can trap a fire and cause it to widen out when it hits the end of the box canyon. Narrow canyons, fire will jump from one side of the canyon to the other. So a lot of things we have to look at as we're approaching a wildfire. What was the wind doing? What influences did the terrain have? I like this picture. I took this in Trinidad, Colorado, and here we had a combination of terrain and wind and to a big extent fuel was driving this fire. Did this fire start on the left side of the screen? Absolutely not. Did it start in the upper right part where my mouse is showing, if you can see that? Yes. So here we have the terrain, the fire is running uphill, but we also have the wind pushing it left to right. So some early pictures can give us a clue as to where this fire started. Let me back up one, sorry about that. I like this. This helped us in an investigation, which is in Grand County, Colorado. And this was a time-elapsed picture of the Churches Park fire, which occurred in 2010 and was provided to all of us. You can look, these were taken from hikers, the top left part of the screen at 12:48, almost 12:49. That helps us start, this fire went big, 1,000+ acres, but look how a bystander's picture can tell us where this fire started and it helped narrow it down. But if you look at the time interval from about 12:49 in the top left part of your screen to 1:09 in the bottom right, look what happened in 20 minutes. So some aggressive fire behavior here. It's kind of scary, if you will, but it certainly helped with the investigation on where the fire started. Many areas in the West are affected by beetle kills. There's a bunch of different bugs out there doing different things to different trees. However, beetle kill will dry out the needles in trees, lower the fuel moisture, and just creates exponential fire growth. And we have to kind of rule that out, and how much of an influence did the beetles and the dead trees have on the fire. I like this picture. I took this in southwest Colorado, and we're actually looking down toward New Mexico, and that is a plume-dominated fire. And this thing was running around almost like a tornado doing its own thing. But of concern to investigators is wind was getting entrained in the bottom of this huge plume and sucking in oxygen, and look at it was going up literally 30,000 feet high and throwing embers, creating spot fires all over the place. So this is a classic example of a plume-dominated fire, and it does complicate things on investigations. This fire picture was taken on a fire I was the incident commander of in Summit County, Colorado. Again, it helped us, it was taken by one of our firefighters, it helped us determine the origin. You can see the wind pushing the fire from left to right into a subdivision. I don't want to know what's going on through this homeowner's name or resident's mind, but I'm sure it wasn't good. But again, some early pictures can help us narrow down where a wildfire started. Did the wildfire start above this gentleman's head? Absolutely not. Look at where the wind's pushing it, further to the right. So some early pictures can be a big assistance to us. Another fire that was a picture of a fire that was taken by one of my firefighters. This was a fire in Keystone, the Keystone Gulch wildfire. And here it ran directly toward a ski area. So when I talked about tourism loss, you can think what was going through the ski resort's mind as this wildfire was heading toward these condos and their ski area with chairlifts and gondolas. It also helped us determine approximately where it started. You can see the winds pulling it a little bit up valley here. And this fire did actually start slightly to the right where my mouse is. So early pictures help us significantly. Now, fire weather, what was the weather doing during the fire? That will help. How do we get some of this fire weather? Let's talk about that. Where do we get fire information? That's a picture of me, by the way, on the right. I started out young. But current weather we can get from on-scene personnel. The past weather we can look up at various weather stations that are available on the internet. We call them RAWS sites, RAWS, which stands for Remote Automated Weather Station. We can also look at some popular weather sites from NOAA and airport weather. Fire weather here, I think we were okay. That's a Smokey Bear sign. Smokey's underwater. I don't know whether we prefer Smokey high or low in this case, but it's an interesting place for a sign for Smokey. We can also use some weather information on lightning strikes. There's different commercial applications. This is just but one example. But for a fee, we can obtain lightning strike data that's often accurate to within 10 meters. Here we did one for a 10-mile radius, so that can be very helpful to see if lightning was a cause or had an influence on the fire. So the RAWS data I was talking about, why is it, and that's Remote Automated Weather Station. Why is this important? We're going to look at the fuel moisture, KBDI, big word, that's the Keach-Byron Drought Index. How dry is the soil underneath? We're going to look at the ignition component. So if I took 100 embers and threw them up in the air, the ignition component would tell me how many of those embers could have started a fire. Currently, at the time of this presentation in August of 2020, we're seeing ignition components in the 90s, which mean if I threw 100 embers up in the air, our ignition components in the 90s. That is significant. Spread component, how fast the fire is going. The ERC, that's a fancy word for energy release component, but it tells us how angry a fire is going to get. What is the potential, and why did it move so quickly? And we also look at the burn index, which is a wind influence on the fuels. Relative humidity is huge. When we get to single digit RH, and the 1 to 10, we have significant fire growth and spread. Even in the teens, we'll see some rapid fire growth. For those watching this in the southeast part of the country, RHs are higher, but we still get aggressive fire spread. So it is relevant to your location. The dew point, how much moisture is in the air at any given temperature. Wind speed and wind direction are huge. LAL, whoa, what's that one? Lightning activity level. If we had an LAL of 0 for the day, lightning probably didn't start that fire. If we had an LAL of 5, lightning activity level, the sky was lit up and lightning was bouncing all over. So what is this LAL? That was 1 meaning not much, 5 meaning a lot. Now here's the fun part of this presentation. Pay attention here. Wildfire investigations are different than structure fire investigations. We do things slightly backwards for anybody who's a structural person watching this. We go from the least damage to the most damage. Why is that? Sometimes in structure fires we'll do that. Oftentimes in a wildfire, I will switch that around. And I did this to see if you'd pay attention. Sometimes we'll look at the most damage, and when a wildfire started, it may be the least damage. So we have to look at things in totality. I'm looking at char depth, which causes some burn and char on trees. The deeper the char depth, the more intense the fire was and gives us an indication of where the fire hit. Classification we'll talk about. Spoliation, we need not touch things. Let's take care to preserve evidence when possible, and we got to look at some specific training on this. Wildfires, we talk funny, have different terminology. Wildfire reports can be helpful from first agencies. Wildfire equipment can certainly disrupt a scene considerably when we have bulldozers and fire engines all over the place. Evidence collection, there are some specific ways to pick up evidence from wildfires that are different than structure fires. And we'll talk about the cause classification here a little later in this presentation. And location, why is that important? Who owns the property? Different properties have different rules. We'll show you a picture of that later on. Private versus public versus federal. We've got to know whose land it is on and what are the rules for getting engaged. Here is an example of a fire that occurred in Summit County, Colorado. Small fire, 2 acres, no big deal, but we had 3 different landowners involved. Private land, where we had insurance companies. Forest Service land was involved, and we also had land owned by the Denver Water Board. So we had 3 different properties involved, property owners involved, with different rules for each of them. So make sure we know the rules and whose land we're on before we get involved. We got to go through this a little bit, so bear with me, but 921 is important. There is a specific chapter 28, which is near and dear to me, but here it names some specific criteria for our investigation. So if you're new to wildfire investigation, crack open the 921 book, go to chapter 28, and go through some of the terminology and look at the different factors. We're going to cover many of them here today. 1033, important for particularly for any attorneys looking at this or insurance companies. Make sure your investigator is trained in wildfires. They are significantly different than structure fires. Here, 1033 specifically requires that we remain current on the topics and we have specific training in that topic, not just structure fire investigation. I want to take a pause for a second and let you absorb these 3 bullet points. They're extremely important. We're going to be talking these 3 names for the rest of the presentation. Advancing fire. That is where the fire is going to. It's with the head or the front of the fire. We have intense burning there. That's where the fire is running, almost in the big fires like a tsunami rolling through the woods. That's the advancing fire. There are specific burn patterns we see with it, and I'm going to show you some. Backing fires, all right? Fires will back against the wind, all right? They don't like to, but they'll fight the wind a little bit and back against the fire or slowly back downhill. And that's kind of at the rear of the fire that we call it. And that's where we fight these fires from. It's a little safer there, but there are specific patterns left from a backing fire. Then finally, a flanking fire. You know, in a wind fire, we'll see it almost in a V or U type shape, and the flanks are the sides of the fire, and we'll see one side of the fuels getting burned. So we look at the patterns that are created from these three definitions, advancing, backing, and flanking, and they will help us significantly in determining where this fire started. Here's a picture of an advancing fire going from left to right. The wind is pushing this fire in this sagebrush from the left to the right. That will leave its own set of patterns on the sagebrush. You can even see an angle of char, a low to high pattern right here. So fire is creating specific patterns that help us tell us where the fire came from and where it went. Another advancing fire, left to right in this case. This is going to leave specific scorch marks. I talked about depth of char on trees. It'll also leave an angle of char. You can see how the fire hits it on one side, but runs up the trees in a wind event. That's leaving some specific patterns that will clue us into where this fire started. Backing fire. Here, the fire is fighting against the wind. The wind's advancing the fire to the right of your screen, but it's backing slowly right down here, kind of pushing against that sage. That's leaving some specific burn indicators that will tell us where the fire backed to. Now, before we get into what caused these things, which is the fun part, we got to figure out where it started, okay? Origin comes before cause. So we need to take a 2,000 acre, 30,000 acre fire, 10 acre fire, whatever, and get what's called a general origin area. Generally, that's 1 to 2 acres. How do we do that? I'll show you. And then hopefully we can get to a specific origin area, which is more manageable, the size of an office, a desk, something smaller where we can actually do a grid search for possible cause. Only after we find out where the origin is should we look for the cause. The cause doesn't come first, origin comes first. So how do we narrow a big fire down to 1 or 2? Here was a picture obtained from a news helicopter. This fire went big, but we can see this big fire. We've got a approximately 2 acre area, which took this large fire that went several hundred acres down to 2 acres, makes it a lot easier for investigations. Interviews obviously help. Talk to people who saw the fire. Someone reported it. Find the first RP. Let's get the 911 tapes. Talk to news folks. Everyone nowadays has cell phone videos and cameras. Let's get some early pictures from them. Even doorbells and homes. I have this Ring doorbell thing in my home, which is filming my whole front yard. So there are cameras all over the place. We just got to go look for them, including some of the commercial applications like YouTube. So these can certainly help. After the fire, we can use drones, which help us in putting together an effective case. So here, use your imagination. Here is kind of the heel of this fire. This thing was huge, literally 25, 30,000 acres. This was in the panhandle of Texas. Here's the flanks of the fire, the left side. I'm running my mouse along it. Here's the right flank, kind of bird dogs in and out a little bit. But you can see this entire area was burned, but a nice drone picture helps us and identify what we call a general origin area. Here's where the fire backed a little bit to the heel until suppression people put it out. And in this case, we have some power poles that were in question at the time. So drone photography can be extremely helpful. Here's another drone picture of a fire. Again, this is in North Texas, my favorite place. Here's the heel of the fire, right back here. Here's a flank. This would have been the left flank. This fire advanced from left to right. Here's the right flank of the fire. We'll see our own patterns and indicators on the flanks, and we'll see indicators where it advanced. We'll see indicators where it backed. This fire, in fact, started right around here, if you can follow my mouse. Once we get a general origin area, we need to narrow it down a little bit. Wildfire investigators use flagging to assist them. They are tools. And we use both macro, which is big, large-scale patterns. I'll show you pictures. And micro indicators where you need a magnifying glass or you need to get on your hands and knees. And you can see different color flags here are used to aid us into finding a potential origin. This fire right here, blue flags were used for backing. I'll cover more of this later on. The yellow flags were the flanks of this little fire, and the red flags were where it advanced. And this white flag is an area of interest. We'll get into this in a bit. The specific origin area, I like to narrow down to a tenth of an acre at the most, but preferably looking at patterns using kind of a clockwise and counterclockwise approach. We'll take that general origin area, try to narrow it down to a specific origin area, and then we can start looking for the cause. Generally start, and I'll use this picture for an example, staying where the fire advanced. And we follow the advancing indicators back and forth. Here I'm using a serpentine method. When we start to see backing indicators, then we're getting close to knowing where this fire started. I'll show you some good examples here in a second. Now I have a bullet. It's time for a grid search. Here's the nitty-gritty. This is where it takes time if we have to look for a specific cause that is not obvious, like a campfire ring, a burnt up car, something just sitting there saying, I did it, I did it. We have to get on our hands and knees and grid search it. And that is painstaking and time consuming, but often worth it. Here's a detailed look at a specific origin area. The advancing fires where the red flags were, again, we are using magnifying glasses to look at some indicators. The yellow flags were where it flanked on the sides, and then we had some backing indicators. I'll show you pictures. And then you can see a grid search was done using twine, and we'll leapfrog the twine, so we're covering every area in the specific origin area to try to find the cause of this guy. A few bullets here. We need to document our flagging on a map. Pictures help, but I also use a map. And if it looks like this is going to be a high profile case, whether it's for subro, prosecution, defense, I will GPS every flag and what type of indicator I was looking at. Again, being anal on this is good. Blue flags are used for backing, yellow for flanking, and red for advancing, and they are just tools. White flags we'll use for a point of origin or evidence. I love it when we get to use these. Green flags are used more and more. We hadn't used them in the past. They show up good in pictures, and we will use them specifically again for some evidence collection or a point of origin. Here you can see these are some Forest Service investigators getting close to a fire. This is an example of a grid search technique. It's two pieces of twine and they're leapfrogging on each other, documenting it specifically to try to find the origin of this fire. Once we start gridding and getting into a specific origin area, I will use tape measures or measuring wheels, as well as GPS to use reference points. These are things that will not move, like a big rock, a big tree that just isn't going anywhere. And we'll actually triangulate the specific area of origin and hopefully the ignition area using triangulation and some reference points that are just not going to go anywhere. And we'll measure them in feet, like 20 feet, 1 inch. 164 degrees from rock number 1. These are two friends of mine, Luke Conance and Joe Wick. They're Forest Service special agents, and I've learned a lot from them. And here they've narrowed down this fire through a grid search technique. They are using reference points. You can see Jill, her left hand's on a rock there that was a stake was put in, and we're actually measuring this reference point in inches to the evidence that was collected. So it takes time, but it's worth it. Once evidence is found, and I'll show you this evidence in a bigger picture here, we can't just pick it up with our hands and disturb it. It's very important to leave, in this case, there were some matches. I'll show you a picture of it later on, but we need to show the matches and the host fuel bed underneath. So we use a flat shovel or even part of a baking sheet or a flat piece of metal to preserve a cigarette or matches in the host fuel bed underneath. Do we make mistakes? You bet. I've made them all at one time, but hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. We need to use a systematic methodology every time. A team approach is fantastic. The more eyes, the better. By yourself, can you do it? Of course, but more people, the better. I like getting out there with a team. Someone can do interviews, someone can document evidence. If we have a drone pilot, all the better. We can be flying a drone over us. Burn patterns can be confusing. We have to look at them in totality. And if we're not sure what they mean, take a picture and email it to someone so you know what you're looking at. Make some circuits around that perimeter, the general origin area and the specific origin area. I do a clockwise and a counterclockwise search of that because I see things when I approach them in different viewpoints. Let's look outside the area of origin. Sometimes we need to rule out spot fires or find evidence that's not readily close to where we think it started. Not doing complete interviews. My gosh, take your time. People have seen things. They know stuff. Talk to the locals. Find out where cameras are, where the weather stations are, where the winds come out of. Locals know a lot. Let's do some digging. If it's a big money case or you're suspecting arson, follow the money. Works well. Try not to leave the origin unsecured, just like we've learned in structure fires, but if we can secure the origin area either with a fence or security guard, that leaves it undisturbed so we lessen the impacts of any spoliation of evidence. Evidence collection, we should follow the ASTM guidelines for evidence collection carefully. NFPA 921 also outlines it specifically. And with wildfire, as I mentioned, there's some specifics using a flat shovel or whatnot to take the evidence in the host fuel bed, put it on a cookie sheet and wrap it up so we can see how it interacted with that first material ignited. Please don't jump into looking for the cause. Go to the indicators, get the origin first, then we look for the cause. This one I put in here because it messed me up on a fire, actually up in Kremlin, Colorado. I was following what I thought were advancing indicators, and it didn't make sense to where I thought the fire started, but the fire department effectively and rightfully so did a big burnout where they ran along with drip torches and flares to set a backfire. That gave me a whole set of patterns, and I needed to just talk to the fire folks and say, did you put fire down in the ground? And once I did that, then the fire made perfect sense. So talk to your local fire agencies to see if they put fire on the ground. Spot fires are where an ember lands in an unburned area and starts its own fire. This can mess with your head because then we have a separate ignition area and we need to rule out spot fires as an area of origin. Sometimes we can't. Magnets are helpful if we suspect any magnetic debris along the side of railroad tracks, interstates. For example, a magnet can help pull up any material that might have caused a fire. Don't skimp on pictures. Take them from several angles. Take them from a general viewpoint to orient oneself to the mountains, to interstates, to other homes, to power lines, to roads, and then start narrowing it down as you get into origin, general origin area, specific origin area. And then if we find the cause, that's where we take a lot of pictures. in between GPSing and using reference points. Learn to enter the burn area from the advancing area of the fire. Right, that's where the most damage was. So we go from the most damage in this case to the least. Very important. Once we start to see backing indicators, then it's time to slow down. We're getting close to the specific origin area. Look at the stuff we can look at. I'll try not to get too excited on this, but I will anyway. All these are indicator categories. They are things with arrows telling us where this fire started. Was an area protected from an advancing fire, like the leeward side of a log or rock? Grass stems will bend toward where a fire came. Needle freeze. I'll show you pictures of all this, but we have needle freeze, and needles will freeze where the fire was advancing. Depth of char, angle of char is my favorite. I'll show you that on trees. Spalling rocks can start popping with moisture underneath and show us where a fire advanced from. Leaves, particularly in backing indicators, will curl toward where the heat came from. White ash is fantastic. That's where the heat was the greatest and tells us where the fire came from. And some V patterns. Well, we'll look at these here in a little bit. Here's a classic example of a macro burn pattern. This I took in Loveland, Colorado, actually, and this gentleman used his backyard as a driving range and paid his kid the nickel or something to go get each golf ball. He left a lot out there. There was a wildfire, and here with this golf ball, the fire impacted it from right to left. All right, so here we have a char or staining. You can pick which term you want to use, but this fire impacted this golf ball. It's still good enough for me to use. Impacted it from right to left. Again, a nice advancing indicator right here. Look at the remains of this power pole. This was taken outside of Boulder, Colorado at a wildfire. Which way did the fire impact? Come on, everybody, raise your hand. All right, I know what you said. Came from right to left. You are correct. Look at this beveling effect in this log. The depth of char. Not much depth of char on the left side, the right side. This fire chewed away at the mass of this pole significantly as it advanced from right to left. Here's one of my favorite pictures. This is taken out in lovely Waldron, Kansas, but a classic example of angle of char. Which direction did the fire hit this tree? This is a trick question, you guys. All right, I'll give you the right answer. Many say left to right. No, no, no. This fire came from right to left. Look at this angle right here. The fire came in from the right, down low, and the wind was blowing from right to left, and it ran it right up the back of this tree, almost creating a little bit of an eddy effect. So this is a classic angle of char. The fire came from the right to the left. Fantastic macro pattern. Here's another angle of char and a little bit of needle freeze. See these needles pulling to the left? And again, it's low on the right, high on the left. Came in down low, popped up high on the left, and I think I used the right flag, a red flag for advancing, and you can even see the white ash on the tree. That fire hit the tree from the right to the left and left white ash for us. Sorry about this guy, this little armadillo at a fire in Florida. Everything wanted my blood down there, the bugs, the snakes, the critters, but at any rate, this armadillo, as sad as it is, left a good burn indicator for us. Oops, I'm sorry. And this fire hit from left, kind of bottom left of the screen to the right. Came from down here, if you can see my mouse. Finally caught this little guy, left it staining and sooting on the shell, and the fire progressed to the top right of the screen. So a lot of things to look for when we're out there. Here's another trick question. Where did this fire come from? Remember that angle of char? This fire came from right to left. It hit this power pole down low. The wind was blowing from right to left, and it blew it around the pole and ran up the backside of the pole, creating a fantastic angle of char. You can see it's burned here, not burned on the right. So this fire came from right to left. Fantastic macro pattern. This is a picture I took at the Tubbs fire in Napa Valley, California. Very large fire, close to 100,000 acres, many lives lost, many homes lost. It was sad. But here, this fire came from right to left. The fire did start near some power lines on the right, but the wind was blowing. It was 40 to 50 mile an hour winds. We actually got some needle freeze, and it just literally pushed these leaves to the left and just froze them in place. And that was a classic example of an advancing indicator. Another advancing indicator. Look at this bevel and depth of char right here. So this fire clearly took, this log took a hit from the bottom to the top. I also use these little sheets down here, trick of the trade. You won't find it in the book, but these are fantastic to depict these pictures to a jury, to lay people that may not understand what we're talking about. So consider using them. Here is a micro indicator. This, when you're on your hands and knees, look at this little eggcorn. They call them eggcorns in Texas, but I won't go there. But this eggcorn took a hit right here. See the staining? It's protected on the top left. It took a hit from the bottom right. So not only large scale indicators, but we're hands and knees, and in my case, reading glasses or a magnifying glass to look at some of these micro patterns. Here's another example of spalling. This rock took a hit, some moisture underneath caused it to pop, and it left a nice advancing indicator. This is from another fire in California. I forget what kind of fruit this was, but that's irrelevant. But this was hanging from a tree, but they took a hit from the right. See where it's burned right here? Protected on the left. So this fire came from the right to the left and progressed in that fashion. It's the first time I've used fruit on a tree to help me identify the origin. Found beer cans, whatever beer this was, but here this fire was backing slow, slow, slow. See a firefighter's footprint right here, and it stained this can. So this fire backed very subtly to this can from the bottom right and then kind of stopped, and the left side of that can was protected. Here's an example of leaf curling. It curled to the right. So this fire went from the left to the right and just curled those leaves on this shrubbery. How about that for a word? From the fire came from the left to the right. Example, white ash in a protected area in back of this big tree that was down. This was more of a flanking pattern where the fire skimmed along this log, this down tree in one way, and you can see back here it really didn't do too much behind it. Another example, micro indicator, where we see grass curling toward that fire. So this fire again came from left to right. An example of needle freeze in the conifers. This was a large fire, came ripping through and froze the needles. You can see they're all bending, kind of pointing to the right side of your screen. Another indicator of depth and char. Look how it chewed away at this down log, and this left side of it was relatively unprotected. So there's a lot of stuff out there, folks, telling us where this fire came from and where it went. Here's a fun part of my job. I got to look at this cow patty. There's other words for that, but look down, there's stuff there. This was all regeneration, the green grass. I was here about a month later, but there were still things to look at. It's fascinating. This fire came from left to right, started chewing up some of the organic material in this cow patty. This fire came from left to right. You gotta love it. Don't know what bone this is from. I'll wait for it to pop up on your screen. I think I'm a little bit ahead of you. There we go. This fire came from the left to the right. So see this bone sitting here? Look at how it actually left staining and chewed away a little bit at the bone in the bottom left part of it. Fire came from bottom left, advanced to the top right. This saw pimento tree in Florida. Again, this tree took more of a hit right here on the right side with a little more mass consumed during the fire. All right, I got a little ahead of myself. I hit click, and sometimes it's a little lag. I apologize for that. So that's a saw pimento we were looking at. I then jumped to some white ash. Which way did this fire come from? Well, the little sheet at the bottom tells you, but here the fire came from the right side and advanced to the left, so we can see all the white ash on the tree. You can see what else I've also done to it. Evidence marker number 2. So I marked this as white ash, advancing indicators, GPS here, and of course plenty of markings if we had to show this to some folks that needed to understand what we were looking at. Another example of white ash, this fire advanced left to right, left some white ash, some significant depth of char on this downed log. Some more white ash, this fire impacted from right to left. Here's one of my favorites for backing fire. What's this grass doing? This grass is pointing to where the fire came from. This fire's backed from the left to the right, and it actually chewed away, and I wish I could show you in real life, but we're doing this virtually. But the fire, it came from the left to the right, creeping along the ground, ate away at the bottom of the grass stems right here on the right side of your screen, and notice how they all fell to the left, the direction the fire came. That is just neat stuff. All right, refocus your eyes here a little bit. How good are you? This is what we like to see. This was almost a 2,000 acre fire, and this is what started it. Let's look carefully. Yes, right here, match. Right here, match. Right here, match. So when we're lucky and the scene was not spoilated, and there was some skill, okay, I'll take a little credit, and we didn't have any suppression folks disturb it, we can often find the exact cause. In this case, it was matches. We need to rule things out or rule them in. Was it smoking, campfire, lightning, debris burning? We can't just say it started because of a match. We've got to rule out smoking. We've got to rule out lightning. We've got to rule out kids and railroads. We've got to rule out a house fire causing the woods on fire. And of course, little kids, they never play with matches, do they? So not only do we have to find what caused the fire, we have to make sure we rule everything else out appropriately. A lot more things to rule in or out as we go through this. A big shopping list here for you. Negative corpus, I can spend an hour talking on this, but we can't say it is this because I say it is, and we've ruled everything else out, so it has to be this. I still need to find a cause and a positive ignition source. So when you have a chance to refresh yourself on negative corpus, because it doesn't work in structure fires and it doesn't work in wildfires. Here's an example of a positive cause. We ruled out all the other things I just showed you, and here we had evidence of line slap, and in this case the fire did start below where these lines impacted each other. Classic example of line slap, a positive cause. Some bird caging, some intense heat on this fire, and a little bit evidence of some slap and some arcing in here. So something to be looked at. I save this stuff and I get metallurgists and or electrical engineers to look at it who are far more knowledgeable than I am when we get to electrical causes like this. But finding it is the first step. Another example, this was in a laboratory setting. Did we have line slap, line rub here? Maybe a little bit of both. But again, that's why we preserve evidence and bring it to a laboratory for examination. Got lucky on this one, a little bit of skill, but with some eyewitnesses, we were able to narrow this fire down to a specific origin area, and through a grid search found this lighter. We did bag it, and I don't remember if we were able to obtain any fingerprints on it or not, but this was an arson fire. We call it a hot set, where you'll flick a bic, so to speak. In this case, the arsonist was not smart enough and left a bic lighter for us. I like dumb arsonists. Preserve your evidence, mark it well. This tree branch right here, was a cause of the Butte fire. This was outside of Sacramento, California, resulted in 3 deaths. This tree branch impacted some power lines. And the end result was some improper line clearance to the neighboring trees. So documentation is huge on this, and we can see where this was 60, 80 feet up off the ground where we had the fire start. We had some ember drop, and then the fire started. Here's another example of some poor line maintenance. I won't mention where this is, but here you can see we have a power line that actually the tree grew around it. I have never seen anything like that before. This one line, I'm trying to follow with my mouse, the tree grew around it. I cannot explain that one, but here's where we need to pay careful attention to causes. This was a transformer pole. This is actually a transposition, I think I'm saying that correctly, pole where lines from the left transpose to the right, and there's the electricians or electrical engineers can tell you why they do that. But this was named as a probable cause of the campfire fire, which occurred in California outside of Paradise. It was a high wind event. And you can see we had some equipment malfunction, which caused a conductor to come into contact with the pole itself and cause some embers or molten aluminum to drop to the ground, starting the fire. Here's an example near a gin mill, Texas, where just very dirty area was exhausting quite a bit of debris onto power lines. We're just asking for trouble on this. So we need to look at things in totality as we look at these. Let me get a couple I want to talk about cigarettes for just a second. Do I have one more bullet point? Yeah, we do. Cigarette ignitions have decreased due to safe cigarettes and a significant fire prevention campaign, but we need some things to be very favorable for ignition, below 14% and fine dead fuel moisture. The tip's got to be exposed to the fuel just right with a favorable orientation. Again, I can spend a half hour on this, but the planets need to align on this. If the winds are too strong, it actually dissipates the heat and pulls it away from the cigarette. The ambient temperature needs generally to be above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And the relative humidity, we like below 22%. Otherwise, ignition is almost impossible. So here are the factors that we need present on the relative humidity for a cigarette to be a viable cause of ignition. The lower the RH, the more viable it can be. If it's over 22%, it's not going to happen. This is just a neat picture I thought I'd throw in there for a little bit. Someone was cooking meth outside in the woods, and look at all these matches. These are all burnt up wood stick matches, literally thousands of them. I'm not an expert on this, but law enforcement did identify it as a methamphetamine production area, and it did start a fire, which we pulled back to this area where we found these thousands of match heads. Kind of fascinating. Here's a incendiary device we found down in Louisiana. This is a fire starter. They wrapped it in some socks. I don't know if the socks are clean or not, but you light these matches. The matches take their time, slowly light this fire starter, and then this whole thing gets going. It's a nice time delay. This one didn't work. I don't remember, but I think they lit it and they actually couldn't even get matches to light. I love dumb arsonists. Did the wood start this car on fire or the car start the woods on fire? Well, here this was an arson fire. This particular vehicle, it started in the passenger, the rear seat compartment, did not start in the engine compartment, and this was lit on purpose, and this started the wildfire. So we need to look at a house or a vehicle. Did the wildfire come into the house or vehicle and cause that to catch on fire, or vice versa? Here's another example of matches. I think this one's a little easier to see. Right here where my mouse is, between inch number 2 and 3.5, from this ruler I borrowed from ATF. No, they gave it to me. But here we found one, and I don't remember if this was a second match. So patience pays off. This power pole had some issues, but they're incredibly resilient. We'll get into power poles here in a second. This actually, people were blaming this as a cause of the fire. Absolutely not. This started about a half a mile away and just chewed up the pole, and the guy wires did a good job keeping it vertical. I do want to spend a second and talk about pole top ignitions. What causes a power pole to ignite up in the crossarm? Any number of things, particularly in the Northwest. Just dust residue with the right amount of moisture in the air will cause from conductor to conductor, and it'll arc. I find that fascinating. You can even do a web search on it, pole top ignitions, and get some good pictures of it. Excuse me. But in this case, how do we know it was a pole top ignition? Well, look, there was no fire underneath here. All right, the fire didn't start at the bottom of the pole and walk up. This started at the top of the pole. We had ember drop down to the bottom, which caused this particular fire. What else can cause pole top ignitions? Failure of the insulators, leakage of the insulators, crossarm structural failures, and bird's nests. Consider using LIDAR in a high complex investigation. LIDAR is kind of a 3D radar, if you will. It's like detection and ranging, and it'll give you a great 3D picture with incredibly accurate directions and distances from items, whether it's from power lines to trees, trees to cars, trees to houses. LIDAR is incredibly versatile and is being used more and more in wildfire investigation. Let's have some fun here with a case study. This case is closed, so we can talk about it. This was in the panhandle of Texas, outside of Amarillo. And here, the power company was at least initially blamed for starting the fire. And this did consume several homes, many hundreds of acres of fire. And it's evident we have power lines on the ground, so one could easily initially conclude improperly that the power line started the fire. Let's jump into this. Well, we surveyed the whole scene. We found the origin is right here, no doubt about it. The general origin area was narrowed down to this 2 acres or so. We had power lines on the ground. That's generally not a good thing. Can they start fires? Absolutely. Did they start this fire? Yes. Did they cause the fire? I don't know. Well, the power lines hit this cattle fence. Isn't that kind of neat? So they were energized when they came down, kind of energized the entire fence. And you can see at the top right here, pieces are missing and did drop to the ground and start the fire of that aluminum. So there was no doubt the power lines did start this fire. But what brought down the power lines? I don't know. Everyone was blaming the power company, but right next door, this was during an extremely high wind event. The winds were coming out of the top of your screen. And in this case, they caught under this outbuilding and lifted some of the roofing material off of it. I found that interesting. I'm like, where is the rest of the roof? That was right here. Let's keep looking. Well, here it is. And guess what? As we reconstructed the scene, the tin roofing came off, blew off of the outbuilding, and actually landed on the power lines. You can see the impact marks where this airborne roofing material struck the power lines, may have caused some sparks right there, but this is what brought down the power lines. So what came first, the chicken or the egg? Here's the rest of the roof. Look at all the impact marks where it hit the power line, right here in the middle of the screen. So in this case, did the power lines, were they the heat source? Absolutely. But was it their fault they came down? No. The roof from the neighbor's property came, impacted the power lines, and brought them down. And one of 2 things, or both, started the fire. The tin hitting the lines while airborne, creating an ember shower, or the lines themselves hitting that cattle guard or cattle fence, which I showed you previously. Another case study. What are we looking at? Broken insulator. Was this insulator down when the fire came through? Yes, because see, here's a protected area. We kind of rolled it over gently. So this insulator was already on the ground. Let's keep looking at this. What is this? These were eggshells underneath a power pole. What might cause eggshells to be underneath a power pole? Birds. So here we had, again, a power company. This is up in northern Montana, case is closed, where the power company was getting initially examined as a possible start of the fire. It was. The power lines did start the fire, but we are able to prove through looking at some of the eggshells on the ground underneath it that, in fact, there was a bird's nest on the cross arm, and that bird's nest, and the bird was watching us from another set of poles, started the fire. So some interesting case studies. We live in a dynamic environment. We got some wonderful people. They're my heroes. I hope they stay safe out there. And I'll welcome any questions. Those watching this online, please feel free to email me at any time, jeff@aiengineers.com. I hope you found this valuable. Have a safe day, and thanks for watching.